Let's talk about the relationship between the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the cross as a Christian symbol, and why the recent embrace of that iconography is actually a return to a previous cultural period. In the weeks leading up to the church's semi-annual general conference, and as part of their massive renovation of Temple Square in anticipation for the Salt Lake City Temple being opened and rededicated next year, the church introduced a new monument. It depicts Jesus Christ carrying a cross. It was done by the very talented sculptor Michael Hall, who has done a number of works for the church, including one on the First Vision that's also found on Temple Square. It features a very Arnold Freeberg-like ripped Jesus Christ. You can tell he was putting in his time in the gym in preparation for carrying that cross, though I'll note there is some gender equality because the woman in the monument also has some CrossFit-worthy shoulders and biceps. As expected, this monument prompted a lot of discussion. Are Mormons going further toward adopting typical Christian iconography and practices similar to their recent embrace of, say, Holy Week festivities? Is this just another attempt of cultural assimilation and appropriation? I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I think there is a bit of that, as I'll discuss later, but there's also a sincere desire among LDS leaders to emphasize their Christian commonalities, a result of a several decades-long movement. And importantly, this embrace of the cross is in reality a return to an older sentiment within the faith. As foreign as it might seem now to see the cross as a symbol on Temple Square, that would not have been unheard of back in the 19th century. Mormons were mostly fine with the cross for much of their first century, and their aversion to it came a lot more recent than you might assume. So in this brief video, I'll try to walk through that history, show you some examples of Mormons using the cross, and then contemplate some of the lessons that we should learn from this larger story. And I also want to emphasize from the start a book recommendation if you want to learn more. Michael Reed's book, Banishing the Cross, The Emergence of a Mormon Taboo, published by John Whitmer Books, is an excellent overview of this topic with lots of important photos. All right, so that's a lot to cover. Let's dig in. It's important to note that in early America, the cross was not used in a widespread sense among many Protestants. One of the things that tied together the many different Protestant faiths was an aversion to Catholicism, this anti-Catholic sentiment that was really at the heart of American religious expression for a long time, that Catholicism was seen as too ritualistic, too rote, too un-American, and their emphasis on the cross was seen as popish, as too much iconography, idolatry, and un-American. And while Mormons largely shared this anti-Catholic sentiment, with some notable exceptions, I'll talk about Mormonism's interesting relationship to Catholicism maybe in another video, Mormons never really replicated the Protestant aversion to the cross. You don't find it in a lot of the early writings. And in fact, the cross showed up in some important places within the early church, often dovetailing with other things like folk magic practice and masonry that also influenced how Latter-day Saints viewed style, the world around them, and even their buildings. You would see the cross embedded within the stonework of the Nauvoo temples, and Joseph Smith even had a cane that included a cross on it. And you see the cross pop up in these other, sometimes occultic, sometimes Masonic, sometimes religious expressions. And then it became much more common as the 19th century moved on, as many Protestants, including Mormons, dropped their anti-Catholic sentiment, at least when it came to style and the cross icons. Michael Reed's book, Banishing the Cross, has a number of really powerful examples of how the cross is found in Mormon quilts, stained glass windows in chapels, the stonework or the structure of several of the early temples, funeral arrangements, including for John Taylor that prominently featured the cross, or jewelry jewelry worn by Mormons. So just to give you a few examples, here are some photographs of a few. Here is an 1852 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants that has the cross embedded within its spine. Here is Joseph F. Smith presiding over a funeral that features a cross-shaped floral arrangement in the Brigham City Tabernacle. Here's a cross that they raised to commemorate the spot where Brigham Young first saw the Salt Lake Valley, emphasizing their Christian principles at the heart of colonization. Here's B.H. Roberts' tombstone that shows them embedding it within their things like, in cemetery. And then here is an image of several photographs showing off a collection of cross-themed jewelry, including Brigham Young's plural wife, Amelia Folsom Young, on the top left, as well as Brigham Young's daughter, Nabby Young Clausen, in the top row, third from the right. Perhaps the climax of this, and in many ways representing the shift toward the aversion, which I'll talk about, was in 1916 when the church proposed to raise a large cross on Ensign Peak, something that may have seemed unheard of later on, but they did not expect much pushback, but they did, with several non-Mormon politicians, some Catholic leaders saying, "How dare you raise the cross when you people aren't really Christian?" And it also sparked some discussion within the Latter-day Saints at that time of, do we really want to embrace that type of image as a cross, which is a good transition point to the next stage of our historical journey. By the way, before I go much further, just a reminder that if you enjoyed this type of historical content, please make sure you are subscribed to this channel. I do deep dives on topics every Monday. I connect the past to the present like this on every Wednesday, trying to show that there is a past that should make sense of the world we now inhabit. And then on Fridays, I pull back the curtain and talk about the historian's craft, either through interviews with authors or dissections of new books, or looking at the sources behind prominent scholarly arguments so that you can have the tools to make historical arguments yourself. I also recommend subscribing to my Kit newsletter. I send out newsletter blasts every other week or so that have links to my various videos, updates, announcements, things that I'm watching, just to keep you up on all the nerdy happenings, as well as I recommend following me on different social media platforms, especially TikTok or Instagram, where I do supplemental videos and posts that go along with these. And if you want to give back, I strongly recommend at least considering becoming a member of this channel, where for a nominal fee, you can get early access to the videos, you get little icons next to your name when you leave comments, but most importantly, you can feel satisfied knowing that you are supporting public-facing scholarship, trying to build a bridge between the academic world and the general public. All right, let's get back to the cross. In Michael Reed's book, Banishing the Cross, he argues that there are some slow-moving cultural forces that lead the church to move away from the cross. For instance, they're losing touch with things like folk magic practices and masonry that kind of shaped the way they viewed that type of iconography. But another main reason was their clash with Catholicism, starting in the 1920s, 30s, and into the 1950s, especially as they tried to had some very personal dynamics within the Catholic leaders in Salt Lake City and church leaders, born in this new atmosphere that saw them more as rivalries, so they wanted to differentiate themselves from the Catholics. And you see out of this clash a number of very anti-cross sentiments from church leaders. The Apostle Mark Peterson calling the cross a form of torture, Joseph Fielding Smith, who shapes a lot of Mormon doctrinal orthodoxy, saying that the cross was repugnant and contrary to true worship of our Redeemer. Bruce R. McConkie, never one to mince words, called the cross the mark of the beast. He also called the Catholic Church the Church of Abominations, so that was, you can see, a clear sentiment. But perhaps the person who institutionalized this sentiment more than any others was David O. McKay, who was an apostle during the first half of the 20th century, became the prophet in the 1950s and 1960s, and really, on the one hand, grew up with this anti-Catholic sentiment, especially the clashes with the Catholic Church in Salt Lake City. At one point, he said the two great antichrists in the world were communism and Catholicism, while on the other hand, he tried to build some relations, and he actually improved the working relationship between the LDS Church and the Catholic Church in Salt Lake City, while still trying to differentiate themselves from the different churches, which meant not embracing icons like the cross that they associate with the Catholic Church. I'd also argue that the Mormon Church's growth to move away from the cross in the mid-20th century was also born out of this anxiety that came from cultural assimilation. As Mormons were seen as more American, and as they were more adopted into the Christian fold, there was probably an anxiety, maybe conscious or subconscious, that we need to make sure we don't assimilate too much. This is the boundary maintenance between assimilation and retrenchment by Armin Moss's Angel and the Beehive that I've referenced in a few videos. And I think becoming more Christian and American was great in some ways, as long as the church maintained its uniqueness in others, and a reversion to the cross was one of those ways. One scholar of theology, Douglas Davies, who teaches at University of Durham in England, once said that Mormons even created a unique atonement theology centered on Gethsemane, because that's where Jesus Christ exercised choice in suffering and taking on the sins of the world, rather than the cross where it's done to him. And this Mormon notion of agency is what places more emphasis on Gethsemane rather than the cross, which also plays into this growing hesitancy or reservations to use the cross. And perhaps the voice that becomes most prominent in the 21st century church and late 20th century is Gordon B. Hinckley, who was president of the faith from 1995 to 2007 and really shaped the church up until then. He was raised with this anti-Catholic sentiment. He spoke out against the cross, or at least explained why the church doesn't use the cross, as early as 1975 as an apostle. And then he would touch on this throughout his prophetic career. And perhaps his most famous address was in 2005, where he directly answered the question, why don't we use the cross this way? I do not wish to give offense to any of my Christian colleagues who use the cross on the steeples of their cathedrals and at the altars of their chapels, who wear it on their vestments and imprint it on their books and other literature. But for us, the cross is a symbol of the dying cross, while our message is a declaration of the living Christ. So a few things to unpack. Of course, Catholics and Christians, as Protestants came to more fully embrace the cross in the 20th century, would emphasize that their focus on the cross does not mean they believe in a dying Christ. They still believe in a living Christ. And it's that symbol of that cross that symbolizes their living nature. So this is a distinction made to cultivate a unique identity here, to differentiate. This is why I say that I think the LDS aversion to the cross is more born out of an anxiety to prove exceptionalist status. And I think you see this play out in a lot of the LDS church, especially up until the most recent decade, where we see some interesting changes. I think it's fair to say that the arrival of the cross on Temple Square in Salt Lake City represents a shift that's been going on for about a decade or so, as the LDS Church has done more to emphasize not just its Christian status, but its Christian commonalities with the wider world of believers. A more willingness to celebrate, commemorate, and talk about things like Good Friday or Holy Week. The downplaying of previously unique components like Moroni, which I talked about in a video last year. And even Russell M. Nelson's emphasis on the Christus as the official logo for the church, alongside with his encouragement that people give up using the word Mormon, instead using Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a mouthful that unfortunately is hard to replicate every time. So yes, on the one hand, I want to emphasize what I know many of you are probably already shouting at the screen, that there is cultural capital to be gained by this performance of Christianity, especially as Latter-day Saints are now part of this firmly entrenched religious right coalition in the United States. And abroad, I would emphasize that the church is trying to do more to emphasize its Christian identity in these foreign countries where they're trying to get a foothold, that they're not wanting to emphasize their rivalries. So there are pragmatic, one might even say political reasons for embracing these images. But I also want to push back on some of these sometimes much more partisan lens of Mormons embracing the Christian icons like the cross, because I do believe that there is a sincere push from many in the church, including the leaders, to highlight Christian commonalities and demonstrate a devout Christian faith. This is a through line, if you look at it from the historical lens, that dates all the way back to the 1970s and 80s, as the LDS Church tries to downplay its distinctiveness and embrace a more coherent Christian image that buys their commonality with the wider world. So I don't think you can separate these motivations, the pragmatic political calculations of trying to emphasize that we belong in this Christian coalition, along with the sincere devotion of trying to say that we too are Christians. In the end, I think it's a good thing that the LDS Church is trying to become less parochial and emphasize Christian commonalities. But the big message is going to be what is the idea that's associated with this practice? What is the message behind this performance? If it's just a performance to gain this political, coalition and to gain cultural capital, then there's not going to be much benefit. But if it means it's a return, an emphasis on peacemaking, on Christian good and morality, some of the themes that did appear in General Conference last week, including from Dallin H. Oaks, who emphasized that Latter-day Saints should be peacemakers. That's a Christian image or Christian message that I think matches the image. And I think it's a reminder that we should understand this iconography, these words, these practices within their broader context. History, in other words, remains relevant, making sense of things like the arrival of the Christian cross to Temple Square, something that would have been unimaginable just a few decades ago, but now, as I hope this video makes sense, is a culmination of forces that have already been in the works. I hope this video made sense. If so, hit the like button, share with others, subscribe to the channel if you like this content, and become a member if you want to give back. History has never been more relevant than it is today because it helps us make sense of these happenings in our world and remind us that there is a history that we need to keep in mind.